Two American heroes died recently. One of them famous, the other not so famous, but both of them real heroes. Both of them legendary figures in America over the past half century. The most famous one was Hank Aaron, the black baseball slugger who hit 755 home runs and broke Babe Ruth's record. The other one was the Hank Aaron of journalism, if you will, Neil Sheehan, correspondent for the New York Times, who brought the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and to the American public. That was his big home run. Neil Sheehan was a friend of mine. I worked with him at the New York Times in Saigon, in Washington, and on the Pentagon Papers, holed up in a hotel room in New York for 3 months. I'd like to tell you a few stories about Neil. I first met Sheehan in Saigon in 1963. I had just come to Saigon to replace another legendary Vietnam War correspondent, David Halberstam, then the correspondent for the New York Times. Sheehan at that point was in his mid-20s, a one-man bureau for United Press International, competing with three guys from the Associated Press. And so he formed a partnership with David Halberstam in order to be able to cover both the Vietnam War, which was outside in the country, in the Mekong Delta, and to cover events in Saigon, like the Buddhist priests who were burning themselves alive to protest against the government of the Catholic president Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, who ran the secret police and were chasing Halberstam as well as all the dissidents. So Halberstam and Sheehan shared stories, shared their notebooks, shared their reporting. And when I arrived in Saigon just after President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, I fell into the partnership with Neil Sheehan. He was quite a guy. I remember one morning I had come into town very early. I had been alerted that there were tanks in the streets. And sure enough, when I went by the home of Duong Quan Minh, who was the leading general in the junta, the head of the country at that point, I noticed something peculiar about the tanks, which normally guarded his house. Instead of their gun barrels being pointed outward to protect big men, they were pointed inward, as if they were menacing big men. Looked to me as though somebody might be putting big men under arrest. I was pretty new to Saigon at that point. I went down to Sheehan, who had his office on Tudo Street, just off Tudo Street, where the correspondents met not far from the Caravel Hotel, and shared it with him. Neil shook his head. Sounds like a coup, he said. I'm going to call him Mordecai. I'll bet he'll know whose tanks those are. Now, Sheehan was really plugged in to all kinds of sources. Halberstam had passed on sources to me, but one of Sheehan's pet sources was a guy he nicknamed Mordecai. He was a CIA agent who had been in the area for a very long time. Lou Conin was his real name. But he'd gotten into an accident and one of his exploits and blown off two of his fingers. So he only had three fingers. That reminded Neil of a famous Major League Baseball pitcher for the Chicago Cubs who also had three fingers. He was known as Three-Fingered Mordecai Brown. So whimsically, Neil nicknamed Conin Mordecai. He went off to look for Mordecai, but first we went by the American Embassy. The night duty officers were on because it was only 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. And we mentioned the tanks in the streets and the guns, and they said, well, they thought it was a military exercise. They kind of dismissed it, didn't make much of it. Neil wasn't satisfied, and neither was I. So Neil went off to contact some of the young Vietnamese military colonels whom he knew. I contacted some of Halberstam's sources. And we got in touch with Mordecai. And Mordecai confirmed what the Vietnamese colonels had told Sheehan. Namely, it was a coup. It was being led by General Nguyen Khan, commander of the I Corps, the First Corps, and they were overthrowing the junta led by Duong Quan Minh. So we raced back to Sheehan's office on just off Tudo Street and sat down in our little Olivetti portable typewriters and banged out our stories. And then we raced to the PTT, the Post Telephone and Telegraph, the way you send cables out from that part of the world 50 years ago. Well, they'd just gotten the order to shut down, no more communications. And it looked bad, but they were still finishing a couple of the messages that they were in the midst of sending out when the orders came in. And I thought, this is trouble. We're not going to get there. But Sheehan always thinking ahead, always organized, always prepared, had brought along a half a dozen bottles of scotch, Johnny Walker Black Label, and he doled them out to a couple of supervisors on the spot there and gave them to a couple of teletype operators, and they just tacked our messages, his to UPI in Tokyo, mine to the New York Times in Manhattan. He tacked those messages on and sent our stories out as if they were a continuation of the work they were already doing. I was amazed. I turned to Neil. I said, I can't believe that this size bribe will open up the PTT when it's been ordered shut down by the new commanding general. And Neil says, it's more than that. I come by here every week. I take care of these guys. A couple of bottles of scotch to each of them every week, and that helps. That was Sheehan. Always prepared, always ready, always on the move, and well connected with the right people. And the right people were not just sources, but they were the people who got your story out to the world. Turned out we were right, and the AP, his competition, had bought the embassy story. They knocked down the idea of a coup, and Sheehan was out with an exclusive, along with me, with the story that there was a coup and the government in Vietnam had been overthrown. It was like that, dramatic, powerful, lots of stories breaking all the time. When we got back to Washington, the New York Times hired Neil Sheehan, and he covered the Pentagon. I covered the State Department, the National Security Council. We broke a bunch of stories together. I don't think any of them was any bigger than the story about General Westmoreland after what was called the Tet Offensive, a real disaster for the American and Vietnamese forces in February of 1968. And Westmoreland, who already had more than 500,000 troops, wanted 206,000 more. We got a tip-off on that. Huge request. And what happened was it caused an explosion inside the Johnson administration, that troop request. It was so massive that some people were saying, we can't give him that many troops, but he needs more. And others saying, no, this is the end. We got to scale down. We got to de-escalate in Vietnam. We got to get ready to get out of there. And at that time, you may recall, Lyndon Johnson, as president, had ordered bombing of North Vietnam. The war was controversial. People were burning their draft cards. Young Americans were fleeing to Canada to avoid the draft. There were demonstrations all the time in the streets. Congress was in turmoil. And this was an absolute bombshell. Well, we worked. Neil worked his side of the river, the Virginia side around the Pentagon. I worked my side of the river in D.C., State Department, White House, and together we put together the story, which broke in the New York Times on a Sunday morning paper 2 days before the New Hampshire presidential primary. And that was a disaster for President Lyndon Johnson politically. He suffered a moral defeat in the New Hampshire primary to Eugene McCarthy of Wisconsin, senator from Wisconsin. And before the end of March, Johnson had decided he was no longer going to run for re-election, and he was going to cut back the bombing of North Vietnam and renew his peace offensive. So it was an absolutely explosive story. When it came to the Pentagon Papers itself, Sheehan had gotten them. I didn't know anything about it. I was at that point preparing to become a correspondent in Moscow. I was taking Russian lessons. Suddenly I got an urgent message. Go to New York, meet Neil Sheehan. He's at the New York Hilton Hotel on 6th Avenue, the Avenue of the Americas. And that is where Neil Sheehan and I lived anonymously for 3 months, pouring through 7,000 pages of top-secret, eyes-only documents from the president to the ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Saigon, from MACV, the Military Assistance Command of the U.S. in Saigon, to the Pentagon, troop requests, diplomatic messages, and it was a real shock. This was, after all, the Pentagon's own secret history. This was the history that the Pentagon's experts had compiled for their own records, because Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara himself had become so disillusioned about the war, he wanted to know what had gone wrong, how, when, and he wanted to put the story together. He did, they did, we got it. But we weren't supposed to have the Pentagon Papers, and so to work on them, and it was going to take weeks, we had to hide right in the heart of Manhattan in that hotel. We were afraid the FBI would catch up with us before we were able to write the Pentagon Papers stories and get them into print. We never registered in the hotel as Neil Sheehan and Hendrick Smith. We registered the room in the name of Gerald Gold, Mr. Gold. Gold was actually the deputy foreign editor of the New York Times, so it was a real guy. But every time we called room service, it was Gerald Gold calling for room service. And we asked for a lot of room service because we lived in that hotel for 3 months. We always laughed about being Jerry Gold. Neil was insistent on it. He was worried that the phones were tapped and we would get caught. And I said to Neil, rather naively, Neil, you're crazy. The United States government would not tap working reporters in the United States unless they thought we were guilty of espionage and working for the enemy. Well, I was the one who was naive. That was 1971 by that time. And I had already had my home phone wiretapped without my knowing it in Washington in 1969 because President Richard Nixon had been angry at some of the stories that I'd written about Vietnam and some of the leaks that I had gotten. But I didn't know that. Anyway, Sheehan insisted on security. I abided by security. Every once in a while, he would go off to see Daniel Ellsberg, who was the actual source of the Pentagon Papers, who had copied them and made them available to Neil Sheehan. And he was always worried about whether or not the Times would really run the papers or not run the papers. Were we serious about it? When would it happen? Neil had to baby him. But what was really remarkable about that experience was that even though Neil and I had together and individually written many stories that exposed the misleading, lying version of the war and what was going on in the war, whether or not it was being won, what the casualty rates were, what the bombing was like, where the bombing was taking place in North Vietnam. We were both shocked to see it in black and white, to see the documents, to see the actual exchanges between President Kennedy and the generals in Vietnam, or President Johnson and Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker in Vietnam. It was astonishing to see one time after another. And we went through this repeatedly. I can remember Neil saying to me many times in words roughly like this, "Geez, Rick, we knew it." And his eyes would be gleaming, burning with both enthusiasm and shock and relief. We knew it. We knew these guys were lying. These bastards had been lying to the American public and to Congress and to us in the media for years about everything. I mean, there were cables in there that showed, in fact, that the Kennedy administration, the president, had approved the Vietnamese coup that overthrew the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. There were cables in there that showed that, in fact, there had been the 206,000 troop request from General Westmoreland, despite the fact that the Pentagon later denied it. As Neil said, these bastards have been lying to the American people time and time again, and now we've got it. We've got them in their own words, in their own documents. We can prove it. We've got to run it in print, and we've got to share it with the American people. The American people have paid for this information. They've paid for these documents. They've paid for these secret documents with blood and treasure. And in the final couple of weeks before the papers were being printed, and we had a whole team of people, they added another couple of reporters, there were half a dozen editors we were working with, the New York Times got worried that the FBI would find us, even though we were registered as Mr. Gold. They moved us into the New York Times itself, into the building. We stayed in the health facilities and the little clinic the Times had inside the building for the last couple of weeks, because the Times publisher and the Times editors figured that the FBI would be far less likely to barge into the property of the New York Times than they would come after us in a hotel room in New York City. And finally, in June 1971, the Pentagon Papers were published, and there was a great sense of relief and a great sense of triumph. We had been scared. We had been worried that we would be arrested, that we would go to jail, that the government would charge us either with treason or with taking stolen documents or dealing in classified documents. The Nixon administration did try to suppress the publication of the Pentagon Papers. It stopped the New York Times after 3 days. The papers then jumped to the Washington Post and other publications. But the courts ruled in the end that this was unconstitutional censorship, and the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the papers could be published, had to be published, and so the New York Times finished them. They were book length. What I remember about all of this is the intensity of Neil's passion, his commitment, and the commitment of the editors at the New York Times, and finally the publisher of the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal, executive editor, publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, to printing the truth about the war. And what Neil Sheehan did as the reporter who got those papers was to bring to the public a reckoning with the truth. That was the power of this Hank Aaron of journalism. His passion, his commitment, his service to the public. Great reporting. Real pleasure, real honor for me to have had the fun and the accomplishment of sharing that experience with Neil Sheehan. Hats off, Neil.